Look, I don't know what maintenance hole you crawled out of, but this is a restricted area. The adults are working. So take your little toolkit and disappear before I have you written up for interfering with a Tier 1 strategic exercise. The voice was a blade, sharp with the unearned confidence of a man who had only ever read the book on hardship, but never the first chapter of its reality. Lieutenant Commander K. Jennings stood with his feet planted wide, a caricature of authority in a freshly pressed uniform that still held its store-bought creases. He had effectively caged the woman against a server bank, using his height and the aggressive jut of his jaw to shrink her world to the cold steel at her back and the condescending sneer on his face. He was young, ambitious, and had mistaken the map for the territory, believing his rank was a measure of his worth rather than a measure of his responsibility. The small crowd of junior officers and enlisted technicians behind him shuffled their feet. A few offered weak, complicit smiles, eager to align with the perceived power in the room. Others studied the glowing tactical displays with a sudden, intense focus, their silence a different kind of complicity born of a desire to avoid the splash when the rock was thrown. The room itself, the strategic simulation center for the entire Atlantic Fleet, hummed with the sound of contained power. It was a cathedral of hypothetical warfare, bathed in the soft, urgent glow of holographic maps and cascading data streams. Here, futures were won and lost in the silent flicker of algorithms, and careers were forged in the crucible of simulated pressure. But in that moment, all the sophisticated technology faded into the background, eclipsed by a very primitive and very public display of dominance. The target of this display, the woman in the plain gray maintenance jumpsuit, did not react. She did not flinch, she did not retort, she did not even seem to register the insult. Her body remained relaxed, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Her eyes, a shade of gray that seemed to absorb the room's low light, held his gaze without challenge and without submission. They were simply observing. It was this unnerving stillness, this absolute lack of a response, that seemed to infuriate Jennings the most. He had expected fear, or at least a stammered apology. Her silence was a mirror, and he did not like the reflection of his own blustering insecurity. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical, menacing whisper. "Are you deaf? Or just stupid? This is the Prometheus scenario. We are simulating the potential collapse of the entire Eastern Seaboard's communications grid. What happens in here has consequences. Something a grease monkey like you wouldn't understand, but there was someone else watching, someone who did understand." From the darkened observation deck above, Captain Marcus Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of stone. He wasn't looking at the swaggering lieutenant commander. He was looking at the woman. He wasn't looking at her plain jumpsuit or her unassuming posture. He was looking at her feet, planted shoulder-width apart, a perfect naval parade rest, an unconscious posture of discipline so deeply ingrained it persisted even under the guise of civilian technician. He saw the subtle, almost imperceptible way she scanned the room, not as a victim looking for an escape route, but as a commander assessing a tactical situation. Thorne felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach, a feeling he hadn't experienced since a near miss with a rogue torpedo off the coast of Tripoli. He knew that stance. He knew that silence. And he knew that the young, arrogant officer below was standing on the detonator of a bomb he couldn't even see. If you believe true authority is worn in the soul and not on the sleeve, type respect below. The lieutenant commander, buoyed by her continued silence, which he tragically misinterpreted as submission, gestured grandly at the main holographic display. It showed a sprawling map of the North Atlantic, littered with glowing red icons representing enemy combatants and blinking yellow symbols for compromised assets. The simulation was not going well. The command team, a collection of the fleet's brightest young officers handpicked by Jennings himself, was floundering. For every strategic move they made, the simulation's advanced AI countered with 3, boxing them in, cutting off their options, and pushing their forces toward a cascading system failure. The air in the room was thick with the metallic tang of stress and the low murmur of panicked crosstalk. "You see that," Jennings said, his voice dripping with condescension as he pointed a finger toward the chaotic display, never taking his eyes off the woman. That is the art of naval strategy. It's a complex dance of power projection, logistical forecasting, and game theory. It's about seeing 12 moves ahead. It requires intellect, training, and a pedigree you couldn't possibly comprehend. He was talking to her, but performing for the audience behind him, reinforcing his own fragile sense of superiority by emphasizing her presumed ignorance. His words were a smokescreen, designed to obscure the fact that his own handpicked team was failing the very test he claimed to be a master of. The woman's gaze drifted from his face to the holographic tank for the first time. Her eyes, which had been placid and unreadable, now sharpened with an intensity that was startling. They moved across the board, not like a casual observer looking at a pretty light show, but like a master cartographer reading the soul of a landscape. She scanned the overwhelming chaos of red icons, the frantic retreat of blue forces, the blinking warnings of imminent system collapse. She saw past the noise, past the panic, past the immediate tactical disasters. Her focus narrowed on a single, almost invisible data stream in the corner of the display, a subharmonic resonance signature from a deep-sea sensor grid that the command team had dismissed as ghost data an hour ago. To them, it was noise. To her, it was a whisper in the dark. To Jennings, this shift in her attention was an opening for another jab. "Oh, captivated by the pretty lights, are we? Don't worry, it's all make-believe. None of these little ships are actually sinking. Though my team's career prospects might be if they don't pull their heads out of there." He trailed off as a piercing klaxon blared through the center, and the holographic display flashed a solid, blood-red color. A synthesized voice, devoid of emotion, announced the new reality. Cascade failure imminent. DEFCON Level 1. Project Prometheus is compromised. Total system collapse in T-minus 90 seconds. The room descended into controlled chaos. Voices overlapped in a frantic soup of jargon and desperation. "We've lost the Eastern satellite link. The carrier group is blind. Repeat, the carrier group is blind. The AI has breached our firewalls. It's anticipating every move." Jennings spun around, his face pale, the mask of arrogance crumbling to reveal the terrified, young officer beneath. His lecture on strategy was over. The test was no longer theoretical. He was failing publicly and catastrophically. The silence he had demanded from the woman was now the only thing she offered, but it was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of profound, unshakable calm. It was the silence of a storm's eye. The countdown timer on the main screen pulsed with a brutal, rhythmic finality. 80 seconds. 79. The frantic energy of the command team devolved into a kind of paralysis, the stunned inaction of men who knew they were beaten. They were staring at a no-win scenario, a Kobayashi Maru designed to test their character in the face of absolute failure. Lieutenant Commander Jennings stood frozen, his hands half raised as if he could physically hold back the tide of red icons that symbolized his career imploding. He had built his reputation on being the smartest man in the room, the strategist who was always 12 moves ahead. Now, the machine was 100 moves ahead, and he couldn't even see the board. It was in that moment of collective surrender that the woman in the gray jumpsuit finally moved. It was not a sudden or dramatic motion, but a fluid and deliberate act of purpose. She took one step away from the server bank, her path taking her directly toward a small, auxiliary diagnostics console in the corner of the room, a terminal that was typically used only by maintenance crews to run system checks. "Get away from there," Jennings managed to stammer, his authority now sounding like a desperate plea. "You can't touch that. That's a live terminal." She paid him no mind. Her focus was absolute. She reached the console, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a fraction of a second before they began to move. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. It was a display of pure, practiced economy, her hands flowing across the keys with the quiet confidence of a concert pianist who had played the same masterpiece 10,000 times. She wasn't typing frantic commands. She was composing. A flurry of command line code filled the small screen, lines of text appearing and executing faster than anyone could read. She wasn't trying to fight the AI on its own terms. She wasn't trying to counter its attacks or salvage their failing defenses. She was doing something else entirely, something no one in the room could comprehend. She was rewriting the rules of the game. She bypassed the primary command interface, sidestepped the tactical AI's predictive algorithms, and burrowed deep into the simulation's core logic. The countdown continued its relentless march. 50 seconds. 49. The command team had fallen silent, their attention now torn between the apocalyptic main screen and the impossible sight of a maintenance worker seemingly reprogramming a billion-dollar wargame simulation in real time. Jennings took a half-step toward her, his hand outstretched, but he stopped. He was finally beginning to understand. He was a man who had spent his life shouting in rooms full of echoes, and for the first time, he was witnessing the profound, terrifying power of silence. He was seeing competence so pure and so absolute that it required no announcement, no rank, no uniform. It simply was. Her hands continued their silent, hypnotic dance across the keyboard. She was calm. She was precise. She was a professional. The final 30 seconds on the countdown timer felt like an eternity. The rhythmic pulse of the klaxon was the only sound in the vast, silent room, a heartbeat counting down to utter failure. Every eye was now fixed on the woman at the auxiliary console, her face illuminated by the green glow of the scrolling code on her screen. She hadn't uttered a single word. Her expression remained one of intense, placid concentration. Then, with 15 seconds left, her hand stopped. She entered one final command, a string of codes so elegant and simple it seemed almost anticlimactic. She pressed the Enter key with a soft, definitive click that seemed to echo in the cavernous space. For a moment, nothing happened. The main screen still blared its warning of imminent collapse. The timer ticked past 10 seconds. A collective sigh of defeat began to ripple through the assembled officers. Jennings closed his eyes, a grimace of humiliation twisting his features. He had not only failed, but he had allowed this farce with a maintenance worker to be his final act. Then it happened. The main holographic display, which had been a chaotic sea of red, flickered once. The klaxon cut out, plunging the room into a deafening silence. The red icons representing the enemy fleet did not disappear. They did not retreat. They all, in perfect, impossible unison, turned blue. The synthesized voice returned, but its tone was different now, stripped of its urgent warning. Threat neutralized. Blue Force assets have achieved total strategic dominance. Mission successful. The screen froze on that final, unbelievable declaration. A wave of stunned disbelief washed over the room. Jaws hung slack. Officers stared at the board, then at each other, then back at the board, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It wasn't a victory. It was a conversion. She hadn't defeated the enemy AI. She had co-opted it. She had found a back door in the enemy's command and control logic, a flaw so deep and so fundamental that no one had ever conceived of it, and used it to issue a single command that made the entire enemy fleet surrender and switch allegiances. It was not a move in the game. It was a move that ended the game itself. It was the strategic equivalent of walking up to the opposing king in a game of chess and convincing him to join your side. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It was impossible. Jennings stood utterly speechless, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. His mind, which he had always considered his sharpest weapon, was shattered. He had been playing checkers, convinced it was chess, while this silent woman in a maintenance jumpsuit was operating in a dimension of strategy he didn't even know existed. His earlier words echoed in his mind, each one a drop of poison. A pedigree you couldn't possibly comprehend, something a grease monkey like you wouldn't understand. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He had been the one who didn't understand. He had been the grease monkey, fumbling with the complex machinery of war, while the master architect stood silently beside him. The quiet in the room was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a presence. It was the sound of 24 paradigms shattering at once. It was the sound of arrogance being crushed under the silent, irrefutable weight of competence. Into that profound, stunned silence, a new sound emerged. The slow, deliberate clap of heavy footsteps descending the metal staircase from the observation deck. Every head turned as Captain Marcus Thorne emerged from the shadows, his face grim, his eyes blazing with an intensity that commanded the attention of the entire room. He did not look at the main screen. He did not look at the shell-shock command team. He walked a straight, unwavering line across the command deck, his gaze locked on the woman in the gray jumpsuit, who was now quietly wiping her hands on a cloth she'd pulled from her pocket, her work apparently done. He ignored the salutes that snapped up from the junior officers. He walked right past the frozen form of Lieutenant Commander K. Jennings, as if he were a piece of furniture. He stopped precisely 3 feet in front of the woman, his posture ramrod straight. The entire room held its breath. They expected a reprimand, an interrogation. They expected the captain to demand to know who she was and what she had just done to his multi-billion-dollar simulation. Instead, Captain Thorne did something that sent a seismic shock through the established order of the room. He brought his heels together with a sharp, audible click. He raised his hand to his brow in a salute so crisp, so formal, and so deeply reverent that it was more potent than any medal or citation. It was the salute of a subordinate to a superior of immense and unquestionable authority. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the lingering shock. "My apologies. I was not aware you were personally overseeing the final diagnostic of the Prometheus scenario today. Had I known, I would have afforded you the proper courtesy, the name, and the rank detonated in the room. Admiral, not a commander, not a captain. An admiral." There was a collective, audible gasp. Officers who had been slouching in their chairs snapped to attention. The few who had been smirking at Jennings's earlier tirade felt a cold dread wash over them. Jennings himself looked as though he had been physically struck. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, pale mask of pure horror. He stumbled back a step, his body finally reacting to what his mind could not process. Admiral Hayes. Not just any admiral. He frantically searched his memory, the name sparking a connection to the near-mythical stories whispered in the halls of the Naval War College. Admiral Evelyn Hayes. The ghost, the legendary strategist who had rewritten naval doctrine for the 21st century. The architect of a dozen classified victories in conflicts the public never even knew existed. The woman whose strategic models were so advanced, so complex, that they were given a name from mythology. She was the creator of the Prometheus scenario. He hadn't just insulted a maintenance worker. He had trapped the god of this digital Olympus against a wall and explained to her how her own universe worked. The sheer, galactic scale of his arrogance was crushing. He felt a wave of nausea and the distinct urge to simply evaporate. Captain Thorne held his salute, his eyes fixed on hers, waiting for her acknowledgement. Admiral Hayes finally turned her full attention to Captain Thorne. She returned his salute with a gesture just as crisp, an economical motion of practiced discipline. "As you were a captain," she said. Her voice, when she finally used it, was calm and even, carrying no trace of anger or triumph. It was the voice of someone for whom this entire situation was not a personal insult, but merely a data point in a larger analysis. "I was running a final stress test on the AI's adaptive learning protocols. My presence was meant to be passive observation only." Her words were directed at Thorne, but their effect radiated outwards, striking every person in the room. She wasn't here by accident. She wasn't a technician who happened to be a genius. She was here in a specific, calculated capacity, dressed in a disguise that allowed her to observe the system and its operators in their natural state, unfiltered by the deference her rank would normally command. She was running an experiment, and Lieutenant Commander Jennings had just become her primary variable. Captain Thorne slowly lowered his hand, though his posture of deep respect remained. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the petrified Lieutenant Commander. Thorne's expression was no longer just grim, it was glacial. "Lieutenant Commander Jennings," he began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave that promised swift and merciless consequences. "You are the officer in charge of this watch. You are responsible for the conduct of this team and the integrity of this exercise. And you have just provided the most spectacular demonstration of catastrophic command failure I have ever witnessed. And I was at the Battle of the Serpent's Tooth." The reference was not lost on the senior officers. The Battle of the Serpent's Tooth was a legendary disaster, a case study in command arrogance that led to the loss of 2 destroyers. To compare Jennings's actions to that was the verbal equivalent of a keel hauling. Thorne took a step toward Jennings, who seemed to shrink under the weight of his gaze. "You stood here in the heart of this command center, and you did not see the mission. You did not see the threat on the board. You saw a woman in a jumpsuit, and you made an assumption. You chose to perform your authority instead of executing your duty. You were so preoccupied with the insignificant patch on your own shoulder that you failed to recognize the 4 stars that were standing right in front of you, waiting to see what you would do." He gestured back toward Admiral Hayes. "This officer," he said, his voice thick with a reverence that bordered on awe, "is Admiral Evelyn Hayes. Her call sign, for those of you too young or too ignorant to know, is Ghost." She earned it because she has a habit of appearing where she is least expected and solving problems that men like you declare to be impossible. The strategic doctrine your team just failed to execute, she wrote it. The very simulation you are running, she designed it. The impossible solution to this no-win scenario, that wasn't a trick. It's the final exam, and you weren't even qualified to take the test. Each sentence was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling every pillar of Jennings's identity, his intelligence, his rank, his judgment, his future. The room was utterly silent, save for the hum of the servers, which now sounded like a funeral dirge for a dead career. Jennings could not speak. He could only stand there, drowning in the abyss between who he thought he was and who he had just proven himself to be. The story of what happened in the simulation center that day did not just spread, it detonated. It moved through the naval base like a shockwave, traveling through whispered conversations in mess halls, encrypted messages between ship captains, and late-night calls between stunned junior officers. It became known, instantly and forever, as the Ghost in the Machine. The tale was told and retold, each telling adding another layer to the legend. They spoke of the lieutenant commander's blinding arrogance, his words repeated verbatim as a cautionary mantra against hubris. They spoke of the admiral's impossible calm, her silent endurance in the face of public humiliation. Most of all, they spoke of the moment she stepped to the console, the quiet confidence of her hands as she single-handedly turned an absolute catastrophe into a victory so elegant it was almost art. The story became more than just gossip. It became a teaching tool. It was a stark, brutal lesson in the dangers of assumption and the true nature of authority. It reminded a generation of young, ambitious officers that competence was the only currency that truly mattered, and it often wore the most unassuming of uniforms. For Lieutenant Commander Cade Jennings, the aftermath was swift and absolute. He was formally reprimanded by Captain Thorne in a closed-door meeting that was said to be mercifully brief but soul-crushingly direct. He was stripped of his command of the Prometheus project and reassigned to a dreary desk job in logistics, a place where his strategic ambitions would be confined to tracking shipments of spare parts and rations. But the formal punishment was nothing compared to the internal one. The man who had entered the simulation center that morning, confident, arrogant, and certain of his place in the world, had ceased to exist. In his place was a hollowed-out shell, haunted by the memory of his own voice, his own sneer, the suffocating shame of his failure. He spent weeks in a state of numb disbelief, replaying the event in his mind, each time feeling the fresh sting of his own foolishness. He avoided the mess hall, took his meals in his quarters, and walked the corridors of the base with his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of his fellow officers. He saw his own arrogance reflected back at him in their averted eyes and hushed conversations. He had become a ghost of a different kind, a walking warning. But eventually, the numbness gave way to something else, a flicker of profound, painful clarity. He realized his failure wasn't just about misjudging one person. It was about a fundamental flaw in his character. He had built his entire identity on a foundation of rank and superficial knowledge, and the Admiral, with her quiet competence, had demolished it with a single keystroke. 1 month after the incident, he submitted a formal request. It was not for a transfer to a more prestigious post or an appeal of his reassignment. He requested to be voluntarily demoted to the rank of lieutenant and assigned as a junior watch officer on a destroyer, the most basic, unglamorous command track job available. He wanted to start over. He wanted to earn his way back, not through theory and ambition, but through duty, humility, and the quiet accumulation of real experience. His request was unprecedented, but it was approved. Admiral Hayes, for her part, never spoke of the incident again. She filed her report on the simulation, a document that was as precise and dispassionate as everything else she did. It noted a significant vulnerability in command-level situational awareness under pressure and outlined a new series of training protocols designed to correct it. Lieutenant Commander Jennings's name was not mentioned once. Her focus was not on the individual failure, but on the systemic weakness it had revealed. Her silence on the matter was more powerful than any public condemnation could ever have been. It communicated that the personal insult was irrelevant. Only the mission mattered. However, she was not oblivious. She read the report of Jennings's voluntary demotion. A few weeks later, as he was preparing to ship out to his new, humbler assignment, he found a small, unmarked package in his quarters. Inside was a single, worn, leather-bound book. There was no note. The title on the cover was Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Tucked inside the front cover was a single, underlined passage. The pride which is proud of its want of pride is the most intolerable of all, Jennings understood. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, nor of condemnation. It was a lesson. It was a challenge. It was a map for the long road back. The legend, meanwhile, continued to grow. The small auxiliary console she had used was unofficially christened the Ghost Station. Before a major simulation, junior officers would walk by and lightly touch the keyboard, a silent ritual to ward off arrogance and invoke a measure of the Admiral's impossible calm. The recording of her solution to the Prometheus scenario was classified at the highest level, but the transcript of her code became the foundation for a new course at the Naval War College. Titled Asymmetric Strategic Redeployment, it taught future commanders how to look beyond the established rules of engagement and find victory in the places no one else thought to look. The event created a new kind of institutional vocabulary. To pull a Jennings became shorthand for letting one's ego override one's judgment. To have a Hayes moment meant to find a simple, elegant solution to a hopelessly complex problem. Her actions that day had done more than just win a simulation. They had subtly but permanently altered the culture of the fleet. She had held up a mirror, and the entire institution was forced to take a long, hard look at its reflection, to question its own assumptions about what leadership looked like, what authority meant, and where true strength resided. It resided not in the volume of the voice, but in the quality of the action. It resided not in the rank on the collar, but in the caliber of the character. It resided most powerfully in the quiet, undeniable force of demonstrated competence. The ghost in the machine had become the conscience of the fleet. A year passed. The story of Admiral Hayes and the arrogant lieutenant commander had solidified into a foundational myth for a new generation of naval officers. It was told to every incoming class at the academy, not as a piece of gossip, but as a core lesson in the philosophy of command. The Ghost Station was eventually encased in protective glass, a permanent installation in the simulation center with a small brass plaque that read simply, "Competence is the only rank that matters." The cultural shift was tangible. Senior officers were observed taking more time to listen to junior personnel, regardless of their station. The base's maintenance and technical crews reported a marked increase in the level of respect they received from the command track officers. The Admiral's silent lesson had propagated through the system, creating a healthier, more cohesive, and ultimately more effective fighting force. The Prometheus doctrine itself was updated, with a new addendum based on the events of that day, focusing on the critical importance of identifying and protecting against cognitive blind spots in leadership. The fleet's readiness scores and strategic simulations climbed to their highest point in a decade. The changes were real, and they were saving hypothetical lives in simulations, which meant they would one day save real lives in a conflict. Far out in the South China Sea, aboard the destroyer USS Winston, a junior watch officer named Lieutenant K. Jennings stood on the bridge during a tense standoff with a hostile vessel. The situation was escalating, and the captain was being pressured by his senior staff to make an aggressive move. The air was thick with the same kind of stress that had filled the simulation center a year ago. But Jennings was a different man. He was quieter now. He observed. He listened. And because he was no longer focused on the sound of his own voice, he noticed something everyone else had missed, a faint, anomalous electronic signal from the hostile ship, a signal that was not consistent with their stated hostile posture. It was a subtle detail, the kind of whisper he would have ignored a year ago. He calmly reported his finding to the captain, suggesting it might be a sign of an engine malfunction, that their aggression might be a bluff to cover a critical vulnerability. The captain, a man who had heard the story of the ghost in the machine, chose to listen to his quiet lieutenant. He de-escalated, offering assistance instead of threats. The hostile vessel, its bluff called, accepted the help and retreated peacefully. The international incident was averted. Jennings said nothing of his victory. He simply logged the event and prepared for his next watch. He had finally learned the lesson of the book he carried with him everywhere he went. He had learned that true strength was not about being the loudest man in the room, but the one who listened most closely to the silence. The legacy of that day in the simulation center was not a statue or a commendation. It wasn't a name on a building or a footnote in a history book. It was a living, breathing principle that now ran through the veins of the fleet. It was the quiet confidence of a young lieutenant on a lonely bridge in the middle of the ocean. It was a respectful nod a captain gave to an enlisted technician before a critical mission. It was the question that every commander can now ask themselves in a moment of crisis. What am I not seeing? What assumption am I making? Admiral Evelyn Hayes remained a ghost, a near-mythical figure who would occasionally appear without warning to observe, to test, and to teach. She never sought recognition or fame. Her reward was not in the accolades, but in the results, in a fleet that was smarter, humbler, and more lethal than it had been before. Her story served as a permanent reminder that the most powerful weapons in any arsenal are not torpedoes and missiles, but wisdom and humility. It proved that respect is not a privilege of rank to be demanded, but a consequence of character to be earned. The greatest leaders are not always the ones who stand on the podium and give the rousing speeches. Sometimes, they are the ones who stand silently in the corner in a gray jumpsuit, observing, waiting, and knowing with absolute certainty that when the moment of crisis arrives, their actions will speak far louder than any words ever could. True legacy is not about the noise you make while you are here, but about the silence you leave behind, a silence filled with the echoes of your integrity, the resonance of your competence, and the enduring standard you set for all who follow. It's the quiet, unshakable proof that what you are is infinitely more important than what you appear to be. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over blind arrogance, and where true strength defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.